Well, we've been in the last 3 weeks, we've been in this series called It's Complicated. We've been talking about our relational life, and what we've said is, and I don't know if I'm yelling at you or not yelling at you, so if I'm screaming right now, if this is your first time here, like, man, that pastor screams, like, I can't hear myself, okay? I'm like all congested here, so if I'm whispering, I'm sorry as well, but we've been saying over the last couple weeks that, the best parts about our life are our relationships, and the most frustrating aspect of our life is our relationships. And, we oftentimes are the ugliest with the people that we love the most. And so how can we pursue God-designed relationships? How can we allow God to move in our heart in such a way that we have the relationships that He has in mind? How can we take something that's complicated and make it something that we enjoy, not just because we're acting a certain way or we have all of our life together, but because we've allowed God to transform our heart? And the big idea for this series over the last couple weeks, if you haven't been here, has been simple, that great relationships are possible, but they're not probable. Like the relationships that you desire in your life, they're possible, they're just not probable. Like the marriage that you desire, the great marriage you want, it's possible, it's just not probable. The great friendships you desire, the intimate connections that you desire in your life, possible, not probable. The connection that you long to have with your kids, the deep emotional connection and bond that you long to have with your kids, possible, probably not probable. You know why? Because it takes work. It takes intentionality. And so often what we think is that the quality of our relationships are a reflection of our intentions. We all have great intentions for relationships. But the reality is the quality of our relationships are a collection of our choices. Every choice that you and I make in the context of our relationships determines the quality of those relationships. And so we're saying, okay, God, would you allow us to be more intentional? Would you allow us to learn some principles to not just alter our behavior, but to transform our heart? Because you and I with a transformed heart makes relationships better. No matter what relationship you're in, when you allow God to transform your heart to be more like His, your relationships become better. And the theme verse for this entire series has been this verse out of Romans chapter 12, verse 2. And it says this: don't copy the behavior and the customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you'll learn what God's will is, His perfect and pleasing and good will. And so one of the things that it's tempting in the church to do is just to say, okay, in order to have better relationships, we just need to act better. We just need to get our act together. We just need to modify our behavior. And what this verse is saying is, hey, what you really need is you need a new heart. You need new thinking. You need to allow God to transform you. And the culture that we're a part of puts a less than a premium value on relationships. We've said this over the last couple weeks, that our culture teaches us inherently that relationships are disposable or they're interchangeable. If you're not happy in your marriage, just go get a new one. If you're not happy with the people that you work with, just get a new job. If you're not happy with your friends, just get new friends. Like if a family member, hacks you off, then stop talking to them, right? And so we're saying, okay, God, would you not allow us to be pulled into what the culture thinks about relationships, but allow us to think differently about the relationships in our life? And one of the ways that I think it's easy to drift into how our culture treats relationships are in the words that we say and how we speak to one another and how we use our words. And if we want to have different relationships, we have to be willing to start talking differently to each other. So you guys, I got to stop telling my family what I'm talking about the day before I talk about it, because they were wrecking my message yesterday. We went out to lunch after the Traders Point Women's Conference. We're all sitting there having a good time, and it's queso at Chili's. I mean, everything's better with queso. And so we're eating at Chili's. There's a big table of us. And we get into this debate. They say, hey, Dad, what are you talking about tomorrow? And I said, I'm talking about the power of our words. And I don't know how we got from power of words to cussing, but we did. Okay, so it just kind of went there. And so then we started, members of my family who shall remain nameless because I don't want to be in therapy for the next 3 or 4 months, started debating whether or not cussing was wrong. And they're like, I don't know if cussing is wrong. Like, how do you know the history of a cuss word? And who made that word wrong? And did Jesus really say that word was wrong? And so then we all just start naming words. So we're just dropping bombs at the table and debating whether or not cuss words are wrong. And there's Traders Point people everywhere. And I'm like, oh my gosh, they're going to think that Hope City is a horrible place. Here's the pastor and his wife just dropping bombs, So then, one of my sons, who I'm not going to say, is like, it's really just conditional. It's all based on conditions. And I'm like, what do you mean it's conditional? He's like, well, it's circumstantial. Whether or not a cuss word is wrong or not. And I'm like, how do you even know? He's like, maybe it's appropriate. Maybe there's times that I'm like, that's like saying murder is wrong, or murder is conditional, murder is, just kind of circumstantial. He's like, it is, self-defense. I'm like, oh, that's a bad example. And so, so we get to this place, and I just started questioning every decision I've ever made as a spiritual leader of my home. And did anything ever stick with my kids? And are they going to be in prison in like 5 or 6 years? And if they don't think cussing is wrong, then what else isn't wrong, right? And so anyway, I'm going to start some counseling tomorrow. It's called therapist and kind of get to work this out. But it was this idea that so many of us have a sliding scale on what is healthy and what is not healthy, not just with cuss words, but with the words that we use. And a lot of that maybe has to do with our upbringing. A lot of that has to do maybe with our temperaments. Maybe that has to do with the spiritual condition of our heart. Maybe that has to do with some of the circumstances in our life. But we can use words in a really appropriate way, and we can use words in a really inappropriate way. And you have been impacted by words. Like your life and my life has been altered by the smallest of words. I love you. Remember the first time you ever heard that? Probably changed your life. I'm pregnant. Remember the first time you ever heard that? I was 20 years old in college, all right? Altered my life completely. How about I do? You can't get a smaller sentence than that. 3 letters. I do. Completely changed your life for some of you that are married. It doesn't take a big word. It doesn't take a lot of words to alter the course of our lives. Words have power. Small words completely alter the direction of our life. You got the house, you're hired, you're accepted, you're fired, it's cancer, I'm done, it's over. Like it doesn't take a lot of words to completely change the entire course of your life. Words are powerful. This passage in Proverbs chapter 18, verse 21 says this: the tongue has the power of life and death, and those who love it will eat its fruit. And what he's saying is our words have the power to build up, and our words have the power to tear down. Like you can completely build somebody up with the words that you choose to use, or you can tear them down with the words that you choose to use. And it doesn't take a lot of them. And the writer of Proverbs says it has the power of life and death. That's a strong phrase. That's a strong statement. You have the power to speak life into people, or you have the power to speak death into people. Not necessarily a physical death, but the death of a relationship, the death of a dream, the death of a vision, the death of unity, the death of community, the death of intimacy. Can all be extinguished with the words that we use. The words that we say to one another carry tremendous power. It's estimated that the average person speaks about 18,000 words a day. It's like every single day you're writing a 54-page book with the words that you use. Now, just looking around the room here, I think there's some overachievers in this room. All right, I think there's some 30,000-word people, okay? I'm not going to point to any section over here, but I see some people that I know talk a lot, okay? I know they're just overachievers. They just like talking. They like the sound of their own voice. How many of you say you know somebody that talks way too much? Raise your hand. How many of you, keep your hand up if you're sitting next to them. All right? Oh, no, I'm just joking. I don't want to cause any, 2 hands over here. I see it. I see you, Mike. I see you. All right. But Jesus, the half-brother of Jesus, writes this letter in the New Testament, and he talks about the power of our words. He talks about the potential our words have to alter our life. He says this in James chapter 3, verses 2 through 6. He says, "Indeed, we all make many mistakes. For if we could control our tongues, we would be perfect and could also control ourselves in every other way. We can make a large horse go wherever we want by means of a small bit in its mouth. And a small rudder makes a huge ship turn wherever the pilot chooses, even though the winds are strong. In the same way, the tongue is a small thing that makes grand speeches, but a tiny spark can set a great forest on fire. And the tongue is a flame of fire. It's a whole world of wickedness corrupting your entire body. It can set your whole life on fire, for it is set on fire by hell itself." Like, he ain't playing around. Right? Like, those are some strong words to use about the power of our words. And one of the things that sticks out to me in this passage is this phrase, a tiny spark can set a great forest on fire. I'm sure that you guys have seen, the news at several different times over the last few years where forest fires are started, and They'll show helicopters or planes even flying over where these massive forest fires are, usually in California or Oregon, a place where a lot of heat and a lot of trees. And there's just acres and acres and miles of just scorched trees, just devastation, and people are being evacuated from homes. What's so amazing is the people who kind of are in that line of work, they can go back, no matter how many acres have been burned, no matter how many homes have been destroyed, no matter how many trees have been burnt to the ground, they can go back to the very moment and the very place that fire started. And they can say, okay, it was this campfire that was left unattended that started that blaze. It was this cigarette butt that was thrown out on the side of the road that started that huge forest fire. And for some of us in the room, we can pinpoint the words that were spoken to us that scorched our soul, that scorched our heart. As I'm talking about the power of words, you remember how you were talked to when you were a kid. You remember the things that were said to you at school. You remember the names that your parents called you. You remember the abuse that coach spoke into your life. And it scorched you. It burnt you. It completely devastated you. And we're going to get into, in just a few minutes, we're going to get into how we can speak life into one another. But I want to take a second and talk about the potential that each of us have, because James is very clear here. The tongue that we have carries tremendous power. And just because we were spoken to in a certain way doesn't mean we have to do that to other people. My parents didn't argue all the time just when they were together. And so I grew up it was very volatile. My house was, my parents argued a lot, and lots of names were called. And my dad and I, we would verbally go at it. And so even as I'm talking, I'm thinking through some of the ways that I was damaged as a kid. And so one of the things that we kind of decided when we got married is, hey, we're going to be different. We're going to do things differently. And we're not perfect, but we've been married, it'll be 22 years this summer. And we have kids that are, they love God, they love each other, they love us. They're not perfect. A couple of them think that they are, but they're not. But we have people ask us all the time, now that we're in this season of life, okay, how did you do that? How did you raise kids? Or how did you stay married? Or how do you and Trish have, what appears to be a healthy relationship? And I would say we have a healthy family. We don't have a perfect family, but I think we're healthy. And I think it starts with how we talk to one another. Like, we don't call names in our house. Like, I've never said to my kid, you're stupid. I've never said to any of my kids, you're so ignorant. I've never said, you're such a jerk. I've tried not to say shut up, and I've caught myself with a couple of my kids. I'm like, shut your mouth, all right? So that doesn't count, okay, in a weak moment. But I've recognized that I didn't have to transfer the pain that I was given into the people in my life. And just from a practical standpoint, take Jesus out of it, take spirituality out of it, take Christianity out of it. If you just choose not to call names to the people that you love the most, it's going to carry tremendous weight. It's going to have tremendous value. If you just choose not to tell your wife or your husband that you hate them or that you want a divorce every time you get in an argument, you're going to have less damage to undo. Like, not even spiritually, okay, just emotionally. Like, if you just say, okay, how do I talk to the people I say I love the most? Would I talk to people who I don't even love like that? The answer probably is no. And for some of us, we haven't really taken into account the major weight that our words carry in the lives of the people that we're around. And so we call our spouse names, or we call our boyfriend or girlfriend names, or we call our kids names, and we think that's just the way it is. We cuss at each other, or we threaten each other. I'm leaving. It's over. I'm filing. And then what do we have to do? We have to go back and undo all of those things. What if you just said, hey, I'm not starting any forest fires. I'm not going to allow any word that I speak to set this person's soul and heart ablaze. Even if you never grow in your relationship with God, which I hope that you do, I'm just saying, practically speaking, that's a huge win. It's a huge win for you, and it's a huge win for the people that are around you. And James must have known that we struggle with this, and the people that he was writing to must have struggled tremendously with this, because he mentions it over and over again in the book that he writes in the New Testament. James chapter 1, verse 19 says, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. That's pretty practical. James 1:26, those who consider themselves religious, yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongue, deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. What he's saying is, your words are directly connected to your relationship with God. Like if you don't have any self-control in what you say, how is God transforming your heart? Right? How is God molding you and shaping you? James chapter 4, verse 1, what causes fights and quarrels among you? James chapter 4, verse 11, brothers and sisters, do not slander one another. Anyone who speaks against a brother or sister or judges them speaks against the law and judges it. And so he's talking to Christians who are actually fighting with one another, saying bad things against one another, slandering one another, speaking harshly toward one another. And how can we show the world the love of God if in the church we don't talk to one another well? We speak ill of one another, we gossip, we slander, we put stuff up on Facebook that isn't beneficial, that just makes people look bad or complains. We talk about people behind their back. We are the first to gossip with our coworkers. And we love God. Right? And so over and over again, all throughout history, the church has been notorious for saying we love God, but then not connecting the words that we speak to God's heart. And James is saying, hey, if you really want to be authentic, if you want to be transparent, if you really want God to show up, connect your words to God's heart. Because you can't say you love God and talk harshly about somebody else because your religion is worthless. And our hurtful words haven't just been reserved for the people that are closest to us. They've been reserved for people who are far from God too. We are so quick to judge, and we're so quick to accuse, and we're so quick to point out other people's sin. We're so quick to use our words to make people who are far from God feel like they should be close to God, even though they don't have a relationship with God. And so the logical thing is, well, I just need to change how I talk. I just need to get better. I just need to try harder. I just need to try to stop cussing. I just need to try to stop name calling. I just need to try to stop yelling. And I'm not saying that's not true. I think that's a short-term fix for a long-term problem. Like, you don't need to modify your behavior. You need God to transform your heart. Like, Jesus doesn't want to change how you behave. He wants to change how you love. Right? And if Jesus can change how you love, he's going to change how you speak. And so if you can increase your capacity to be loved more, then you're going to be able to love other people more. And so what I want to do with the time that we have left is I want to look at not our behavior, I want to look at our heart. Because here's the deal. What you say is a direct reflection of what is in your heart. Luke chapter 6, verse 45 says, a good person produces good things from the treasury of a good heart, and an evil person produces evil things from the treasury of an evil heart. What you say flows out of your heart. And so if we're really going to not just solve a problem on a Sunday and check something off of our list, but if we're really going to be people who function better in relationships for the long term, we don't need just to change how we talk to one another. We need to ask God, hey, God, would you transform this part of my heart? So that as an overflow, words of life come out. So I want to look at just kind of 5 phrases that I think we need to say more in our relationships. And then I'm going to connect those to the type of heart that those phrases kind of reflect. And the first is this. A phrase that you need to say to people more in your life is, you matter to me. You matter to me. That's a heart of humility. When you tell someone that they matter to you, you're elevating that relationship above yourself. You're saying that relationship means more to you than that person knows. And I love this passage of scripture in Matthew chapter 5, verse 22. It says, but I tell you, anyone who's angry with a brother or sister or subject to judgment, again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court, and anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. So Jesus is saying that he's using a phrase that we don't necessarily use. That word Raka basically is just like a biblical cuss word, all right? It was a very offensive word that meant fool, and he even translates it to fool, and fool was one of the most offensive things that you could call someone in Jesus' time. And what he is saying here is everyone matters. Every single person has value. all people matter to God, therefore they should matter to us. And so when we tell people that we're grateful for them, when we demonstrate a grateful heart, when we tell people that we're grateful for them, we demonstrate a heart of humility. Have you ever gotten one of these in the mail? It's called a handwritten note. I don't know if you've ever seen one of these. I know we don't send them very often. They're in some museum somewhere. But I got one this week. And it's not, I don't get one very often. I get nice emails. I get a lot of bad emails too, but I get some nice emails. And I opened the card up, and the first thing on the top is, "You are amazing." I'm like, oh, I'll read on that one, all right? That's typically not how letters to me start, okay? So, but this person goes on to say, there's a couple that wrote me this note. They start talking about how grateful they are for me. Like they said, you matter to me, basically. What you did matters. And back in the summer, I was at this conference, and I met this guy, and he was playing at church the same weekend that we started Hope City. And they were struggling to find finances. They were struggling to find equipment. They didn't have a truck to pull the trailer that they didn't have the money to buy. And so he was just freaking out. And I'm like, bro, it's going to be okay. And he's in Baltimore, Maryland, and kind of a different context than us. We're in a suburban context. He's in an inner city context. He's like 28 or 29 years old. And I'm older in life. I know that the sun is going to come up tomorrow. He was freaking out that it might not, and I'm like, it's going to be okay. And so I start talking to him, and I connect him with a buddy of mine who's in Baltimore who has some resources. I think their church started helping them out financially, and I connect him with another organization that I thought could help them out with some equipment. And so then I started talking to him about once a week, just kind of encouraging him, trying to talk him through where he could find, some equipment, connect him with some of the folks that I knew, and never thought anything about it. They've launched services, and I think it's going well. I haven't checked in with them probably in 3 or 4 months. And out of the blue, I get this note, handwritten, just thanking me for all the time I spent. I never even thought about it. We're talking like less than 3 hours of my time, probably. Right? It wasn't that big of a deal. It was just the humility that they had to say, man, what you did mattered to us. And who in your life needs to know that you're grateful for them? Who in your life needs to say, you know what? You matter to me. You have value to me. We think it, right? But just because we think it, words unexpressed are not delivered, right? Unless you express it, they're not going to feel it. And so you could alter someone's life. You could speak life into somebody in your life, just say, hey, I just want you to know you matter to me. And humility isn't thinking less of yourself. Humility is thinking of yourself less. Right? And so if you start thinking and valuing other people, you elevate them above your importance, it makes a huge difference in relationships. The second phrase that I would encourage us to say more in our community is, I forgive you. And that's a heart that grasps the gifts of grace. Mark 11:25 says, and when you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive them, so that your Father in heaven may forgive you of your sins. Forgiven people should be the most forgiving people. Like people who've experienced God's grace should hold the least amount of grudges. People who have been forgiven of all of their sins, like those of us who call ourselves Christ followers have, should not hold other people hostage for their sins. People who have been forgiven should be the most forgiving people. And there's something that's kind of weird going on in this passage. I don't know if you noticed it or not. Jesus makes it clear that there is a connection between our willingness to forgive others and God's forgiveness of us. I don't know how it works. I don't know what that connection is. It doesn't really say other than that one phrase. But there's something tied to that. That as you and I are willing to forgive, it makes God's grace in our life more abundant. It allows God to dispense more grace to us. That's how serious it is. And there's nothing that limits our ability to love other people like Jesus calls us to love other people than built up resentment. If you are resentful, if you struggle with bitterness and resentment, you automatically have a wedge between people and you. If you're unwilling to forgive people, no matter how much you desire intimacy in your life, you're not going to be able to manufacture it. It's the forgiving heart that's able to experience intimacy. And for many of us, we've been hurt or we've been wounded, and we think in our heart and our mind, man, if I forgive them, then they get away with it. Like if I forgive them, then I'm excusing what they did to me. If I forgive them, then they win. And when you forgive somebody, they don't win, Christ wins. Because when he wins another piece of your heart, the resentment and bitterness that you have built up diminishes. And you experience more intimacy with God because God is a forgiver. It's his character, it's his nature. God forgave you. And so when you forgive other people, even when they don't deserve it, and despite or in spite of their reaction or response to it, you become more like Christ. Because you're not in control of how they respond. You're not in control of whether or not they receive it. You're not in control of whether or not they change as a result of it. You're only in control of offering it. Forgiveness doesn't just set them free, it sets you free. And you're free to experience life the way that God intended. 3, the third phrase is thank you. That's a heart of gratitude. I want us to say thank you more. It's a heart of gratitude. In the book of Luke, Jesus has many encounters in the book of Luke with different people. And in the book of Luke, he has an encounter with 10 lepers. And leprosy was an interesting disease in the New Testament because of the Levitical law, which is the Old Testament law, they created these sanctions around people who had skin diseases. They were viewed as unclean. They were viewed as people who were far from God, or that God had cursed, or their parents had sinned, or they had done something wrong, that God was angry with them. And so God gave them this outward disease that was visible to everyone. And they were the most unclean and the most unrighteous people in that civilization. That's how they were viewed. And so leper colonies were created because people with leprosy could not live within the city limits. They had to live at least 5 miles outside the city gates. They could have no contact with people. And the worst part is, not only were they to live in isolation, not only were they not allowed to have contact with people, and not only was the pain of the leprosy disease itself almost unbearable, they had to announce their disease to people as they saw them. So I've said to several of you today, I don't feel good. Let me give you a little elbow bump because I'm trying not to hug people. If you're new, I'm a hugger. So, but I won't hug you today. But they could have no physical contact at all. And then they had to say, unclean, unclean, unclean. Like, I'm unclean. I'm unholy. I'm not holy. Stay away from me. And so there was this social dynamic and this spiritual dynamic that was associated with leprosy. And so Jesus comes in contact with these 10 guys who all have leprosy. In Luke chapter 17, it says this. Now, on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called in a loud voice, Jesus, Master, have pity on us. So Jesus hears these guys. He's not intimidated by them. He's not put off by them. He goes up to him. He says, hey, here's the deal. I want you to go show yourself to the priest. And when you get to the priest, you'll be healed. And they're like, all right. They have nothing to lose, right? They're just going to go for broke. They have leprosy. They have no other hope. And so they believe, they take Jesus at his word. And so they start walking and start traveling toward the priest. As they're traveling, they're healed. All right? Like Jesus, it was like a surprise healing. Like he didn't have to wait till they got to the priest. It was like a drive-through healing, okay? It's like ordering with your Chick-fil-A app. Like you don't have to wait for the meal once you get there. You order it ahead of time and you just walk in and grab it, okay? If you don't know about that, it changed my life. You should download that, okay? And so these guys experience this healing as they're going to the priest. One guy comes back to say thank you. And it's not a Jew. If you notice, the passage says they were traveling along the border of Samaria. So it's this Samaritan guy, this guy that Jews hates. The Jews and Samaritans hated one another. But this Samaritan comes back and thanks this Jewish rabbi for this healing. None of the Jewish people did that. They went about their business without saying thank you. This is how Jesus responds in verse 17. Jesus asks, were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise except this foreigner, except this Samaritan? Then he said to him, rise and go, your faith has made you well. Now, most scholars believe that what he's talking about there isn't physical. What he's talking about is your faith has made you well. Is he's talking about your faith has made you forgiven. But there was a spiritual and a physical transformation that took place in that guy's life. You want healthy relationships. You want to decomplicate your relationships. Speak more gratitude. Be more thankful. Say thank you more. I know this doesn't sound like rocket science, but we don't do it very often. We take things for granted. And what happens when you and I live with a sense of gratitude, Jesus knew that gratitude and entitlement could not live in the same heart. That the more grateful we are, the less entitled we become. And so you stop thinking that people owe you. You stop thinking that your wife owes you. You stop thinking that your kids owe you. You stop thinking that your boss owes you a promotion. You stop thinking that, this world owes you something. You stop thinking that God owes you, the more grateful that you become. Gratitude always decreases the amount of entitlement in our life. And you allow God to move, and you stop taking things for granted. You don't take your spouse for granted. You don't take your job for granted. You don't take your kids for granted. You're thankful for your home and your provisions and your food. You're thankful for the little things in life. And that begins to spring and speak life into the relationships around you. I've never met anybody that I've thought, oh man, they're just too grateful. Right? Like I've met people that are completely ungrateful. Like that guy thinks he deserves everything. Right? But I've never walked away from somebody going, oh my gosh, they're so grateful. I don't know what to do with them. Right? Because we don't drift towards gratitude. We drift toward entitlement. And so if you want to start speaking life into your relationships, just say thank you. Thank you for little things. One of the greatest things that my kids have done, and they've gotten better at this in the last few years, especially my older two, because they're getting to be more independent and they can value things more, but they'll say, hey, Dad, thanks for dinner. When before, like we went to Chili's, when they were kids, that's just what we did. We just bought things, right? We just bought them stuff. We just fed them as our job. But the older they've gotten, I want to give more, the more grateful they are. My kids are taking notes right now. But I think God's the same way. I think that God longs to lavish us with things. He just wants us to be grateful for the things that he does give us. And when you start speaking gratitude in your relationships, it brings health to those relationships. All right, number 4, I've gone over here, so let me go through these last two pretty quick. The next one is I was wrong. I was wrong. That's just a sign of a repentant heart. Proverbs chapter 28, verses 13 and 14. This is the Message translation. It says, you can't whitewash your sins and get by with it. You find mercy by admitting and leaving them. A tender-hearted person lives a blessed life. A hard-hearted person lives a hard life. It's interesting. You don't find mercy by not admitting what you've done wrong. You actually find mercy by admitting what you've done wrong. And I think so often we think that if we can hide what we do wrong, then God's going to give us grace. But a repentant heart is this idea that we're willing to admit when we're wrong. We're willing to say, I need to own that. I was totally out of line there. And repentance is just kind of an old school church word. It just means that when you recognize something's wrong, you walk in the opposite direction. And for so many years of my life, I was wrong. I was sorry for getting caught. I wasn't actually sorry for what I did. And so, first 10 years of Trish and I's marriage, I grew up, like I said, in a pretty volatile home, and so I hated conflict because my parents argued all the time, and I swore we're never going to be like that. And so I just avoided conflict at all costs. And I got to this place in our marriage where we would be in an argument, and I would say, you know what? Just tell me what I need to apologize for, and I'm sorry. You ever been there? Right? Because you've been arguing so long, you don't even care anymore. You're sorry. But I wasn't really sorry. I just wanted the argument to be over. But when you say to somebody, hey, I was wrong, and when you say to somebody that you were wrong before they tell you that you were wrong, you know how much currency that gives you in a relationship? You know how much restoration that brings to a relationship? When someone takes personal responsibility for offending someone or hurting somebody or taking advantage of someone, when you say, hey, I was wrong, I was out of line, I am so sorry. You're allowing that person to see into your heart. You're allowing intimacy to be restored. And maybe we don't have the relationships that we desire because we're never willing to admit when we're wrong. We're always waiting for somebody else to apologize to us. We're always waiting for somebody else to say they're sorry. Well, they don't deserve my forgiveness until they apologize to me. And maybe the relationships that you long for are found by just saying, hey, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was out of line. What wounds could be healed if you stopped clinging to your rights and simply apologized? Maybe to a parent, or maybe to a sibling, or maybe to a coworker, or maybe to a spouse. This isn't complicated. It's just sending a text message. It's just writing a note. It's making a phone call. It's taking the first step and saying, okay, God has spoken life into me. I want to speak life into others. Lastly, as we'll close with this, a phrase that I really want us to talk about more and speak more here is, I believe in you. That's a heart that's encouraging. It's a heart that's encouraging. Look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 11. So encourage each other and build each other up, just as you are already doing. It's interesting that Paul is talking about building each other up because he was in desperate need of being built up. Before Paul was Paul, he was this guy named Saul early in the New Testament. And he was a ruthless Christian killer. He did not like Christians. He did not believe Christianity was the way. He was a religious leader. And so he was overseeing the execution of Christians in several towns and several cities. And he began to have this notorious reputation that when he got to a city, he was getting there because there was an execution of Christians that was getting ready to take place. And so Paul has this dramatic conversion experience, and his life is radically transformed. And you know what he wants to do after Jesus saves him? He wants to talk about Jesus. You know the problem? Everyone's scared of him. Like all the Christians are like, are you crazy? Like you were just killing Christians like 2 weeks ago, right? Like we put like a time limit on people, doing something for God. They have to wait 2 years until they, come to know God. Paul wanted to do it like 2 minutes later, all right? And so he's trying to go and trying to tell people about Jesus, and they're running in fear from him. And there's this guy named Barnabas that steps up who people respected. And he says, I believe in Paul. I believe that God's authentically transformed his life. I think he has some credibility. I think you should listen to him. And because of Barnabas' encouragement, because of Barnabas' belief in Paul, Paul was the first church planter. The American church today exists because Paul planted churches in places that churches had never been. And the word Barnabas actually means son of encouragement. Like this guy was just there to encourage Paul. And I wonder how many of our relationships would be different if we just spoke encouragement into one another. If we just said, hey, I believe in you. I know you're going through a tough time right now, but I believe in you. I know that your husband left you, but I believe in you. I know that you're not doing well in school, but I believe in you. I know that you lost your job, but I believe in you. I know that your boyfriend broke up with you, but I believe in you. I know finances are hard, but I believe in you. What if this place became one of the most encouraging places where people came to this place and they could not believe how encouraging we were? That reflects the heart of God. That allows people to know that, you know what, there's a God that believes in us. And he believes in us so much that he spoke life into us. He sacrificed his son for us. And he gives us life and life to its fullest. And relationships aren't that complicated. It's just us choosing to have a grateful heart and a forgiving heart and a heart of gratitude and a bunch of other hearts that I can't remember right now, okay? A humble heart, a grace-filled heart, a repentant heart. And when you and I do that, we reflect the heart of God. And that's what transforms lives. Let's pray together. God, thank you so much just for speaking life into us, for your belief in us, that you believe in us, you chose us, you've redeemed us. And you call us sons and daughters. Like words matter to you. And God, for some of us who've been wounded by words, and there's this broken part of our heart, there's this disconnect between what you say about us and what we believe about us because of what others have said about us. Would you restore that? God, for those of us that, I talked to several people after first service that were just, man, I got to use my words more wisely. I've got to allow God to help me not lose my temper. All of us struggle with flippantly using the words that we have to wound other people. Would you just help us realize the power of our words? Help us to speak life, to speak hope, to speak encouragement, and watch our relationships begin to change. Because you're more passionate about them than we are, God. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.